Hi, everyone. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for having us here. Okay, so Martin has introduced me. I'm going to talk a little bit about public works and what we do before going into the talk. Public Works is a multidisciplinary group of architects, planners, designers who are critically and creatively engaged with urban and public issues in Lebanon. So today I'm going to draw a bit on our work and our methodology of work to reflect on the theme of the entire hour's event, but also specifically this session. All right, so if I want to think a bit about the way the theme was framed, which is kind of opposing transformation and creation, I'd like to maybe propose a slight readjustment of how we see the relation of these two things, not necessarily as opposed, but rather that the new inevitably reconfigures what's already there. And even the new has to deal with things that are there, whether it recognizes them or not, whether it sees value in them or not. So then this tension between transforming and creating starts to collapse. And then the question becomes, how do we do transformation or creation, and how that takes place? So to put two extremes on the table, on one hand, this process can happen through negotiation, through creating a shared understanding, through empathy towards what's already there, while keeping a healthy amount of disagreement. And on the other hand, it can happen through violence and injustice. It can happen through exclusionary practices and approaches, through dismissing what's already there, and through a kind of absolute compliance to a specific vision. And this can lead to kind of jarring contradictions and the sense of dispossession. But even then, we see that even when the new or the process of transformation disregards what's there kind of always reemerges and resists. And this leads to such scenes that we see in our daily lives in Beirut, and that probably, I'm sure you see in your own contexts. So to come back to the theme of the session, which is the question of value. So how do we understand and assign value? I'm going to start with a kind of basic example, an apple. So what's the value of an apple? It has a nutritional value, basic. It can have an economic value. It can have a symbolic value. It can have many, many different values. And this kind of leads me to the core of this, which is the idea of value systems. So the way we value things ultimately comes down to the set of norms, beliefs, goals, and attitudes that we have towards the world. And these can take many different shapes. So what does urban planning have to do with it? So in our work at Public Works, as researchers and planners, we often encounter a recurring tension between two specific value systems. On one hand, use value, and on the other hand, exchange value. I'm going to talk a bit about these. So use value being a more social, qualitative understanding of the value of space, and exchange value being a more monetary, quantitative understanding of the value of space. So to give an example, we can take the example of an unbuilt plot of land in Beirut in the neighborhood of Watam Saitbe, which is where that yellow circle is. So its exchange value would imply an attitude that follows this reasoning. So what is this plot size? How much am I allowed to build there? How much money is that worth? How much can I sell it for? And this kind of behavior is kind of embedded in the way our zoning and construction laws are planned, in the way that The current urban planning practice is conducted in the way that market-driven urban development and policies are taking place. So the legal framework that kind of within which we're working tends to push us into that direction. If you want to look at the use value of this kind of space, which is for us as researchers engaged with spatial justice, let's call it, we like to place the focus on that kind of value. And this often happens by recognizing the social dimensions of a space. So if we look at this plot of land within the larger context of Beirut, we understand many things. I'm gonna give you a bit of context to this plot. So this plot is actually an informal football field. It's a shared space that has been maintained for decades by its users. Most of them are youth in a quite impoverished area. It's adjacent to a Palestinian refugee camp. And it's one of many plots of land in Beirut who are used in the same way, but happen to be privately owned. So the tension between the exchange value and the use value always recurs in these spaces. And since 2003, up until today, we've seen tens of these kinds of spaces closed down, fenced off, built, all geared towards maximizing their exchange value. And at the same time, dismissing the practices, the decades of maintenance, and organizing that the communities around them have put into them. So then the plot, according to its use value, is no longer defined by what I'm allowed to build on it, but by its practices, its history, its symbolism, its context, the identities that are there, its traces, and its kind of daily politics. So what seems like an empty plot of land on a map is actually anything but empty and holds a very high use value. So how do we determine the social value of space? At Public Works, we do this mainly through two things. Something we call action research, which is doing research on the ground in a way that's not entirely removed from the reality. So we implement certain things and then we reflect on them. And so the research is kind of constantly engaged with the communities that it's addressing. And to be able to do that in a way that makes sense for us, we use a lot of participatory tools and approaches that engage the communities that we're working with. So in the case of this plot in Marlies, we did this by looking at the history of the plot, how it was formed, how it came to be what it is today, in terms of its size and its shape and its surroundings. We also do this through observation and documentation of the current state. And this kind of requires a kind of sensitive eye to things that we don't normally look at. Some of them have to do with maintenance or lack of maintenance, looking at how things pile up in the space, what kind of traces are left there, what kind of people we don't see, but we see traces of. And this kind of links back to the idea of visibility that has been mentioned more than once. And we've done this for Marlies, but we've also done this for a number of informal football fields across the city. And so here, the images are kind of small, but this kind of exhaustive documentation, valuing kind of every trace that you see, whether it's a graffiti, whether it's markings to define a goal for the football game, whether it's piles of concrete blocks that are put there so that children can climb over a fence and access the field. So all these things, even if we don't see them while they're being used, allow us to read the space and kind of extract its social value. So in the particular case of Marlies, this project continued in a more in-depth way. We took it as a pilot to test out a few things and see whether we are able to replicate it in the different fields that we identified throughout the city. So to do this, we held workshops with the youth, and the idea was to kind of make visible the user's understanding of the space and how they value the space. So we do this using different tools. One of them is mind maps, which you can see here. So where kids are asked, how do you go from your house to the field? And what do you see once you get there? And after seeing the photographic image of the field, I'm pretty sure you don't see it this way, but according to how it's practiced, this is one of the impressions of its users. And these are a few examples of other children's drawings. We also do this by kind of providing tools for documentation and expression. In this case, we handed out disposable cameras, and the kind of assignment was document your spaces of play and your different games. And so this kind of gives us a different set of eyes, and not just one different set of eyes, but rather a collective understanding of how the camp is practiced, but also how the field is practiced and the relation between the two. So then to kind of unpack what these images mean, we projected them again with the children and kind of asked them to reflect on them, to explain to us what is it that they tried to capture. But also beyond the kind of individual understanding of each one of these people of the space, we try to push them to see, or to create a collective mapping. So as a user of the space, who else do you see that uses the space? What other traces can you identify? And so suddenly this kind of abstract map that we see on Google or on a cadastral map of the city, which is just a square, suddenly starts to get populated with different things like walking, wrestling, running around the plot, killing rats, smoking, kissing, coffee and cigarettes, drinking tea, and other things. So for us as architects and planners, this also raises the question of representation. So what does a map really contain? What can it encapsulate in its traditional forms? And what other ways can we experiment with that can convey the social value of the space? Then what we also try to do is something we call creative visioning. So we try to understand also how the users of a certain space project themselves into the future, how they form a vision for how a certain place might develop, and we try to give them the tools to visually represent this. So I'm going to show you a few examples of the results we got in Marlies. This, for example, is called Hadiqat al-Ushaq, the lover's garden, let's say. So moving from something that was primarily used as a football field to suddenly start containing different kinds of activities and aspirations. And here you can see a few more examples. And in the case of Marlies, this is particularly significant because the private spaces of the camp have been, throughout the years, have become much denser and much less easily livable. So such a space suddenly really takes on a very big importance at the scale of the camp, and starts to represent kind of main outlet or space for interaction between different people, but also between the camp and the rest of the city. So why do we do all of this, and how does this, how do we move it forward? How do we carry it into our work? So it's important for us to understand the social value, mainly because if we want to intervene on a certain space, so to create or transform anything inside of it, we like to do so with whoever's already there, and to include them in that vision, and to try as much as we can to gear our professions towards their needs, and try to reduce the friction between our kind of expert vision of this should be like this or this should be like that as architects, and rather try to understand how the users see it, how they practice it, what are their actual needs, and try to move away from more formal or ideal projects for a place. So in this case, what we did is after this workshop, we held a series of meetings with different groups in the camp. Some of them are NGOs, some of them are residents, some of them are political factions, to try to see who are the different users that we were not seeing when we were seeing this place as only a football field. And so this kind of drove a community-driven design where we organized something called the design charrette. Does anyone know what a design charrette here is? No, okay, so, sorry. In architecture, a design charrette is basically an intensive couple of days where design is all you do. So it's an intensive design meetup, let's say. So all of these research findings that we got in the first phase of the work, they were all channeled into this charrette, where we not only thought about a design for the field, for how to enhance what's already there, or how to give space to the different activities, to the different visions. So how to problematize the different tensions that maybe were there. But at the same time, this also raised a big question about maintenance and governance. So it's not enough to make it look more organized. It's also really important to see what are the mechanisms that will support this kind of design in terms of organizing, in terms of maintenance, who's going to level the field when it rains, who's going to pick up the trash when it piles up, how are we going to make sure that the space is accessible and inclusive and that there's not the dominance of one party on it. So all of these things drove a parallel process between the design and the governance set up for this space. So in addition to integrating use value in how we practice our professions as designers, planners, architects, we also see a great need to disseminate such work that highlights this type of value. So in Marlies, this took the form of a zine and a blog and a podcast that we produced with the youth groups. All right. But also, we use different tools, whether in this particular project or others, like public talks, like publishing in different forms. We also create alternative guides to certain neighborhoods in the city based on also research with the inhabitants, trying to pinpoint the kind of social value of historical urban fabrics and social fabrics. We also lead counter-mapping and counter-narrative projects. This is one of them, the Housing Monitor, where we produce animations, we write long reads, and produce maps. And there's also an interactive mapping component which maps evictions in the city. So this is also one of the channels through which we disseminate this kind of approach to urban space. And maybe one of the most widespread tools that we use is architectural competitions. So Think Housing was one of them, and it was a competition for housing alternatives in Beirut, trying to think about the housing crisis that we have, not necessarily only through its economic lens, but also through its social lens. And trying to redefine the terms of the question or the terms of the problem. So coming up against kind of media and official narratives and presenting more bottom-up kind of findings. This is also this publication was a way for us to also disseminate the winning schemes of this competition. If you're interested, you can check it out on this website. And finally, I'm going to end on Mansion. Mansion is where Public Works Studio's office is based. It's right around the corner here. And kind of in our daily lives, we believe in practicing this value system. So this is why we're part of the Mansion community. Mansion was an old abandoned house for multiple decades, and one architect one day found it in a state of semi-ruin, looked up the owner, convinced him to turn it into a community-run space in exchange for no money. So today, by different activities, by just being there, by hosting events, and just like living daily in this space, we kind of activate its social value. But also this takes a lot of maintenance to keep it running. So I'd like to invite you all to pass by Mansion sometime today or tomorrow while you're here. It's right by the bakery, if that's an incentive. You can also find out more about Mansion on this and its residents on this website. And thank you.